Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you for everybody for inviting us to be here yet again. We're delighted to have another opportunity to speak with you and a little update on where we are in our conversation around love and midwifery. So just a little introduction. So you've had a little introduction of both of us there. Diane and I met a few years ago when we were both in the last months or year of completing PhDs, and we met at a conference which was about the type of analysis method we were both using. And when we met each other and we started chatting and realized we were midwives and realized that we'd both been independent midwives and that we both grew vegetables, and we had children, and we had all this in common. We had a great conversation. And then we chatted a wee bit about the different research we were doing, and I was looking at women's experiences that they had found traumatic. So their perception had been a traumatic birth experience. And Diane was looking at the complete other end and looking at women's experiences where they had considered their experience to be very positive and compassionate. And that we found that interesting that we're both coming at it from a very, very different ends of the spectrum. But also, as we started to chat, realized that there was a lot of commonality in what we were discovering. And fundamentally, we were both realized we were talking and looking at the humanity of the people involved, whether that's the women and families and partners, or the care providers and midwives and obstetricians and everybody who's involved. So we decided at the end that once we'd finished our PhDs, we would swap and read each other's. And we were even more convinced that we were both almost coming to similar conclusions, and the relationship between, particularly how compassion might actually be the preventative intervention that may reduce trauma. So we have, that's a whole other conversation. But we started writing a wee bit together and speaking in different places together. And then must be nearly 2.5 years ago now, Diane, we were on a wee online chat, and Diane said, Jenny, sorry, actually just before we come to that, we both realized that in our PhDs, when we looked back, we'd both written about love. I'd mentioned it in passing, thinking, hang on, where does love fit into this human picture? And is it just a 4-letter word that we daren't use in midwifery? And that was I couldn't go down that avenue in my PhD because it was too complicated. It was too much of a tangent to what I was doing. And Diane had also written about it and questioned its place. And so on this day, Diane came to me and she said, Jenny, I think we should write a book. And I go, yeah, okay. She said, well, we could get lots of authors. We could do an edited book, invite lots of other people to write. And I think, yeah, that sounds possible. Okay, what are we going to write about? And Diane said, we're going to write about love. And I went, yeah, we are. So that was the start of it. And then we contacted midwives. Diane did lots of interviewing and speaking to different midwives. I did some connecting. We had a little bit of look on the internet. I thought, well, hang on, have people been writing about this before? And I sort of did a little search and found very, very little material that explicitly uses the word love, either in the title of an article or a chapter or a book. I found some, but very little. And I did the same sort of search looking at nursing, and there was a lot more. And I thought, hang on a minute, I think we need to raise this a wee bit. We need to bring this up into conversation a little bit more. So it just confirmed for us that we needed to write something about this. And then as we spoke to other midwives, and maybe Diane might like to add something here, we were getting a lot of, oh yes, absolutely, I'd like us to talk about this. And we got some people go, well, was it professional, and what do we mean by love? And so we got a good spectrum of thoughts, and all of that feedback helped us to decide what the book was going to focus on and contain, which I'll cover in a wee minute. Do you want to say anything more about that, Diane?
I think that what we realised was that in our PhDs, we'd both mentioned love, hadn't we?
Yeah.
When we went back to look at our thesis, because you forget what's in your thesis, it's too long. And, once you've submitted it, that's it. You've put a bit of distance between you for a while. But when we went back to look, we realised that we had already talked about love. For me, if I thought at the end of my PhD, when you've spent all that time thinking about compassion. Well, I had. And the question that remained really for me was, well, that's great. I know a lot about compassion now, but why would you bother? What makes you bother to be compassionate? And so the seeds of the book were there, both in Jenny's PhD and in mine. We both raised this question, what is the underlying thing that makes us do this? Yeah. And I know as Jenny said, there was very little about it in midwifery because Billie Hunter, she'd done a whole body of work on emotion work, hadn't she? Um, but stopped short of what emotion are we talking about? And I think I loved all that Billie Hunter's work. It was just fabulous. And it was the building blocks really for a lot of what I did and then a lot of what a lot other people have done about emotion work. Um, but yeah, it was the seeds were already there.
Yeah, so I think we just decided we want to explicitly explore this and talk about it, and we wanted to fundamentally start putting this on paper and starting a conversation. So we have completed the book. It is published now, and we'll mention it a wee bit in a moment. But this book is not all our answers or all the solutions. It's just exploring, and there's a lot of excellent. The authors are just fantastic. So I'll describe that in a minute, but brilliant. And we want to start a conversation. So it's so good to be here today. And we hope that those who are listening or those who continue to listen will start to talk to each other about this. Is this real? Why do we not explicitly talk about it? And when Diane said there about that motivation, what drives us to be compassionate, and I had quoted the Dalai Lama in my PhD, and I couldn't get to my PhD in time for this meeting, but I found that the quote pretty much that I used. And basically, he connects love with a sense of responsibility and concern for others' well-being, suggesting that genuine love is not simply a feeling, but also a motivation for action. And that ties exactly with where Diane's coming from as well. So this is what we wanted to really explore in the context of midwifery. So I think Diane might like to go on from here.
Thank you. Yeah. So we haven't been talking about love, but what are we? What have we been allowed to talk about in midwifery? Well, we've been allowed to talk about oxytocin, and that's probably about as far as it has got. It's not that nobody's ever mentioned it because Michel Audin mentioned, not that he's a midwife, but he's an obstetrician, but he talked about love. And there's been one or two other people way back in 2012. Jennifer Hall, in her work, she did some work on a piece of work on spiritual midwifery and mentioned love in that. But generally, as Jenny has said, it's not something that we've talked about. Oh, the dog barking. You can tell it's live, can't you? Um, but we've been allowed to talk about oxytocin, the hormone, and sometimes even a little. I always wonder if this is a little bit tongue in cheek when people say, "Oh, it's called love hormone," and raise their eyebrows. But oxytocin isn't tongue in cheek. Oxytocin is quite serious. So it's not just oxytocin, but it's a number of other hormones that also come into play that are so very involved in the physiology and the emotions of birth and parenting. And of course, we do know about some of the part that oxytocin plays in starting labour and in the birth, in delivery of the placenta, and of course in breastfeeding and in attachment. Attachment, that amazing, strong feeling of bonding and love. What else can you say but love? That happens with the newborn and the primary caregiver. Typically, it's the mother baby dyad. And we know about that and we try to promote and protect that. But if we think a little bit more, if we think a bit bigger than that, we must remember that this emotion, this very strong emotion, has got an evolutionary function, and it's to do with us being mammals. I write quite a little bit about that in the book, and talk about how most most reptiles, amphibians, and some birds, they don't have this. They don't have this need for this strong attachment because their babies, if you like, are born ready to go, and it's on you, get on with it. Whereas with some birds and mammals, their young are not born ready to go. So there has to have been some sort of function which will enable the mother, and sometimes both parents, to nurture this very vulnerable baby, whatever mammal or bird that might be. But of course, with human young, we birth some of the most vulnerable because they are going to need the attention of their primary caregiver, usually the mother. They're going to need that for the longest time. I think elephants come close, don't they? And possibly some of the whales, but you know, it's a long time before our young are independent. So it's an evolutionary response which happened, we don't know, many hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe more. And it has a function. So we can look at it in those terms. But what we argue, and what other people have also argued, we're not alone in this, is that primary love that we think of with the mother-baby dyad is the blueprint for all other loves. It's possible as humans, we've been able to have lots of adaptations of love. So there's maternal love, paternal love, sibling love, there's altruism, there's all sorts of different sorts of love. Love thy neighbor. So we go into this a lot more in the book. So I'm really whistling through this. So what else is there to say about love? Lots more. We have looked at the philosophical side of love. So I've talked a little bit about the hormonal, physiological, evolutionary side, but we've also talked about the physiological side of it. The philosophical side of it. We've looked at it from the point of view of theology, and Jenny mentioned the Dalai Lama, and we've looked at it in terms of world religions and people of no religion. It is universal. We've also looked at it as a value. And this is where it's really quite useful to look at our nursing colleagues. In nursing, there have been some amazing nursing scholars who have talked and written widely about nursing, about love being a value in nursing. And for some reason, we haven't done this in midwifery. Not the saying that we are the same as nurses, but what I'm saying is, and you know, even in medicine, there has been more discussion and writing about love as a value than there has been in midwifery. We're not altogether sure why that is. So Jean Watson was a fantastic nursing scholar who has written about nursing care being based on this value of love. And what does she mean by love? And we've written a whole chapter about what do we mean by love. But what we're talking about is that human connection. It's inside of all of us, and it's about connecting with that in ourselves and then connecting with others. And love is also, we like to talk about it, not the only ones, as a doing word, a verb. So it's not purely an emotion. It's not purely something that happens to us. It's, as Jenny has already referred to, it is a driver for action. And this is where it really comes into its own in midwifery. So there's a whole chapter on love as action. A fantastic midwife called Indy Luna has written that chapter in the second part of the book. But many scholars, many people even outside of midwifery, have written about love as something that we do as a driver for action.
So I think moving on from the idea of love being a verb and a value, and if we think about things like loving care, loving kindness, then you can see how that comes to life. And love is also a choice. So it's not just a woozy feeling and we'll do it if we feel good. It's really hard. And that's one of the things that comes out very strongly in the book. This book is not soppy. This book is not all gooey. This book is actually, and what we've discovered is love is hard. Love requires choice. It requires dedication. It requires sacrifice. There are challenges in it. There are human issues around when something is not loving and when love is not present. So it really is a choice. And when one of the things that has come back to us is what about the challenges in midwifery in the workplace in many places at the moment and many contexts of midwifery. Maybe love is a bit soft and a bit like, oh, really? I mean, how can that actually make a difference here? But one of the things that I feel, and from a lot of the trauma training that I've done and trauma management training I've done, is that one of the key things is that we cannot change other people. I cannot make other people behave or act in a certain way. I can only do that with myself. I can change myself. And that's hard. We all know how hard it is to change ourselves or improve ourselves or be different than we might want to be or need to be or that we think we should. But we can make a choice each day. Today, I am going to be the best I can be. Today, I am going to be positive in my engagements with other people. Today, I am going to be loving in my approaches with other people. And we can choose that. But this isn't about, oh, suddenly it's down to us to do something more as midwives, take on another mantle, be responsible for something else as well as all that we do. But it's about looking at the approach that we're taking towards other people. Are we going to look at them in a positive, loving approach or not? And how do we do that? And what do we need? That includes looking at ourselves. So we have Kate Greenstock, who brought out the book Flourish a couple of years ago, which is wonderful. She's written a whole chapter about self-love, about what do we do in terms of taking care of ourselves so that we then are able to go out and be loving in our approach without a great cost to ourselves, because there's cost involved in this. And how do we seek what we need? And we also, in one of the chapters, we have a person called Claire Wardhaw. She is not a midwife. Her history's in theology, and she actually co-authored a chapter with Professor Leslie Page, which is the most beautiful chapter, and they've written it as letters to one another. They got on like a house on fire. They're great friends now. They've never met each other before, and they've had this amazing conversation, and it's really worth that chapter. Is so special. But Claire says vulnerability makes us feel powerless. Now, can we all relate to vulnerability as midwives? And we need someone, we need another person sometimes to meet our need. And love is the power that can sit within that and make that happen. And love is only manifest in the world through people. And then Kate Greenstock says, the way we love ourselves begins to be reflected in our emerging knowledge of how we contribute best to the people around us. So this is really, this is at the heart of the doing, the verb, and the choices that we make. And then, Diane's mentioned the hormone, the love hormone, and you'd think, oh, we're around birthing people all the time, and we could soak up oxytocin everywhere. If you've ever done 2 hours in a breastfeeding clinic, yeah, you soak up oxytocin, you come out there going, but you would think, we'd be surrounded in love. And so a midwife, when we were chatting about this and speaking to different people, somebody said to us, you would think midwifery would be filled with love, given that we're nurturing the love hormone. But we've lost this love, not because we don't have it. It's buried inside layers of institutional fear, disappointment, apathy, covering up our love for one another. I know it's there deep down. It's how do we get it back? And so that brings me on a wee bit to talk about the workplace, because we have had this question, it has come up a few times. And Anna and Sheena Byram have written an amazing chapter about love for colleagues. And one of the things they say is love can be understood as a social force with the potential to build a sense of community, care, connection in any context, including throughout our workplaces. Our workplaces are social environments where relationships either flourish or become diminished. So we need this in our workplace. We need to look at this. To flourish, we need loving connection between colleagues. We need to be enabled and supported to provide the women-centred care that we want to provide. And when we're unable to do this, midwives can become disillusioned and leave. And actually that ties in very much with the research that I did. My research findings were that one of the most traumatic things for a woman during her birth experience is if she's treated discompassionately then by her care providers. So if she perceives that interaction with the care provider to be negative or dehumanizing in some way, that is one of the most important sources of trauma. So, but you know, that's not coming back to say midwives are in the wrong here. It's about if midwives, we want midwives to really be present to women and give the best. We need to look after the midwives. We need to look after each other. We need a midwife-centred organisation. And that's what they're talking about here as well. We need the midwives to be supported. So we keep going and then we provide that care. And also, we're all very aware in many parts of the country and in different parts of the world that there's a lot of bullying and incivility occurring within healthcare, within midwifery, across all the NHS. And it's a really challenging environment for many, many people. But bullying is a consequence and a symptom of negative culture and poor leadership. And unkind behaviour develops and unhelpful cliques develop. So this is some of the pictures. So Anna and Sheena have really taken this apart and explored it and shone a light on it and said, well, where does love sit within here? In reality, in practice, in everyday work that we do. Can I have the next slide, Diane, please? So just to give you a little overview, we've mentioned there's different parts to this, but we wanted to address this in response to the questions and the conversations that we had. So we've written the book in 3 parts. The first part is about love in context. So what do we mean by love? Diane's written a wonderful chapter there. What do we mean by it? We're not talking about romantic love or we're not talking about sisterly love necessarily. What are we talking about? What do we mean? And then, as I say, Claire Warter and Leslie Page have written a chapter about love and the humanisation of childbirth, which is a very special chapter. And Elizabeth Newnham has written about why we need to talk about love in midwifery, a very in-depth exploration that goes to the heart of concepts like feminism and others. It's a really rich chapter. So I think the love in context really puts love on the map. It says, this is it, it's real, it sits within midwifery and it has a right to sit within midwifery. And yes, we really do need to talk about it. And then part 2, we thought, well, how is it lived out in practice? And some of you may be familiar with, is it Gary Chapman? The name's going out my head there. Gary Chapman's 5 languages of love. Now that relates to romantic love relationships, but the 5 languages, when we looked at them, thought they all link with midwifery very closely. So we have touch, action, words, time, and gift. And so we've written a chapter looking at love as each of those. We've got 5 different authors there. And again, people with really good experience around this. Claire Nutt has written about touch. She's done a lot of work around massage and touch in pregnancy and labour and birth. Brilliant chapter. We've got Indy talking about love in action. Anna Marsh talking about the words, the language. And language, again, is very much at the heart of the trauma or the compassionate response. So Anna does a really good chapter there. And Diane and I have written one about time. Interestingly, there's lots of ways of looking at time, which we found fascinating. Not just that there's not enough of it, but what are the different, there's some really good recent research about how time can be used well. How do we make the best of the time that we do have? A whole concept called slow midwifery. I mean, it's really fascinating. And I've written about what do we mean by gift? And in my thesis, which was interesting when I saw this, because in my thesis, one of the key theories that I explore is the comparison between care provided, care as gift, and vigil of care. So I won't go into that too much more at the moment, but that I really bring that apart and look at that a wee bit here as well, a bit more deeply. So that's part two. So we've got love in context. Where does it sit? Why does it sit? Love in practice. How can it be lived out? How is it being lived out already in midwifery? And we're naming it specifically as far as we can there. And then we thought, well, we need to look at the profession. So we want to look at, firstly, love for self, because this is not about hammering midwives with something else they have to take on. This is very much about how do we ensure that midwives are able to take care of themselves and each other and be supported to give good care, obviously, but also to thrive within this environment and to have the job satisfaction and the joy that they've come in here to do. And we've got Anna and Sheena looking at the whole concept of colleagues and workplace. Michelle Waterfalls looked at love and leadership, midwifery leadership, really interesting chapter. Maeve O'Connell and Naomi Donovan talking about love in midwifery education around students, a whole section about where does it sit within our work with students and supporting students, what does it mean there? And Diane, again, another excellent chapter on love and professional issues, just tying in with where can that sit within the NMC and our professional regulations, and how can we talk about it in that context, what's happening there. So I hope, I believe, and we've had feedback so far, that we've got a very meaty book here. It's not a soppy little, oh, let's talk about love and fluffy bunnies. It's a real hard-edged, meaty book about the context of love in practice, and how it can feed into our profession. And we hope, I believe, and we both hope, that by starting this conversation, we're coming at the whole challenge of the midwifery workforce just now, all the challenging things that we're facing as midwives, shortages, workplace pressures, midwives leaving, newly qualified midwives leaving, all the stuff that we face as a profession. We've tried all the heavy sort of reports and audits and very things. We think let's come at it from a completely different perspective and reignite our passions, but also in a real positive, down-to-earth, grounded way that says this is a way we can go forward. So I have to, at this point, thank each and every one of the authors who worked with us. We had a great couple of years writing this and pulling this together. We were warned, I was warned, and I think Diane was, oh, it's really hard doing an edited book. And yes, it had its moments, but I have to say every one of our authors were fantastic. They contributed some amazing work. They opened our eyes. They enriched this book. There was no way Diane and I could have written a book, but it would not have been this book. And it would never have been anywhere near as rich and valuable as we have now from each and every one of the people that have contributed. So unless Diane has something you would like to add, I think we are ready to say. You've got some questions. We could keep talking, but it would be nice to hear if anybody's got comments or thoughts.
That's right. It'd be nice to talk about the things you want us to talk about, because there's so much that we could say. So we'd love to know what you think.